In this presentation, we will look at how fashion became a global trade, some new trends, and the art and architecture of the Neoclassical era. In the presentation on women's wear, we saw a new fashion for shawls begin. By far the most desirable shawl was the cashmere shawl. They were so prized, many socialites made sure to include them in their portraits. The lady on the right wears an entire dress made of that fabric. The shawl was made of cashmere, a wool that comes from the Kashmir goat in India, Pakistan, and Turkey. It has a very fine underhair that grows in for the winter. Today we also call this fabric pashmina, the Chinese term. This fabric was exceedingly expensive to collect, weave, and export from India. It featured a stylized floral motif we call paisley. We now use the term paisley for any stylized design which looks something like this teardrop made of smaller plant motifs. Later in the 19th century, a factory would open in the town of Paisley, Scotland, to manufacture a cheaper version of these shawls. Everyone then transferred the name paisley to the shawl and then the motifs. Other fabrics and motifs that came from India include Indian cotton muslin and silk gauze. The availability of cotton from India also made velvet cheaper to make in Europe as weavers augmented the expensive silk fibers with the cheaper cotton. Now the wealthy classes and upper middle classes could afford to wear it more often. The motifs woven into the fabric of these dresses are Indian in origin, reminding us of sari fabrics. American cotton production grew exponentially during this era, using enslaved labor and newly invented machinery. By this time, cotton was becoming America's largest export. We see another influence from Turkey in the adaptation of turbans and artistic day coats worn by some ladies in the 1790s to resemble Turkish robes. Ostrich feathers were popular to decorate hats. Ostriches are native to northern and southern Africa, but they were nearly hunted to extinction to satisfy the European fashion market, making the ostrich one of the first animal destructions for fashion. Colonial ostrich farms started during this era to revive the species and supply the demand for feathers. This era brings us some new ways of dressing besides the new fashion silhouettes. Formal mourning or dressing in black is a new idea for society at large. Prior to this, formal mourning would occur at court and among selected aristocrats who took part in a funeral procession. Now the idea of a formal funeral for other wealthy people began to take hold. We see the beginning of wearing full black for mourning and a period called half mourning that combines black and white or gray. We will study mourning in more detail during the Victorian era. The English will experience a second fashion revival in costume history right on the heels of the first Neoclassical revival. In 1815, Britain defeats Napoleon at the crucial Battle of Waterloo. To celebrate, they looked backward to defeating the Spanish Armada, the last time England defeated a threatening enemy more powerful than they were. Fashion plates from this time show a number of details from the Elizabethan era, such as rough collars and divided sleeves. Bathing by the sea becomes an activity for the wealthy who have more leisure time. Shorter dresses with visible pantalettes give women something to wear while they brave the ocean. There will be examples of some 18th century frozen fashion. Not everyone was thrilled with toppling the aristocracy in France. The panier, or the large hoop skirt, had been established as formal court dress and some courts kept them for special state occasions, even though fashion moved on. In this example, we see a woman from Spain wearing neoclassical fashions made to be worn with a panier. The second frozen fashion is servant livery. Prior to this, servants were given clothing in plainer versions of what their masters wore. There will now be an explosion of newly made millionaires and aristocrats who can afford ranks of household servants. Their livery will remain from the past era, adopting fashions from the 18th century, even keeping wigs in some cases. Here we see a footman and a master in radically different attire. This tradition is still with us today. If you see a waiter or a maitre d' in a tuxedo, that is the master's formal attire from the past. You learned some basics about neoclassical art and architecture in the video Neoclassicism Overview. Let's look at some attributes of interior decor and furnishings. The color palette was muted with pastels and white colors on the walls or jewel tones such as dark green. There's a heavy use of gold accents on ceilings and walls. You can see it also in the glassware and china on the table at the left. Motifs found in Roman art are used as decoration, such as eagles, human faces, shells, mythical creatures like mermaids, and garlands and urns. And we have a major technological breakthrough: window glass that is now thin enough to see through, strong enough not to shatter, and affordable enough to actually use. Doors and windows in arch shapes are heavily featured. These interiors, to the people who lived there, looked minimalistic compared to the 18th century. It uses symmetry and classical proportions to make a statement about the power of reason. This interior is a fine example of neoclassical motifs used on the wall and the sober, clean color combinations in off-white and light blue. This wooden parquet floor is an excellent example of using the neoclassical laurel leaf motif as decoration. French decor was much more eclectic, blending Turkish, Egyptian, and Roman styles. Here we can see Turkish-style sofas set lower on the ground with loose upholstered cushions, so different from the 18th century tradition of formal furniture with legs. The rugs on the floors are from Turkey. In the portrait on the right, notice the classical urns and the chair shape to the left of the woman. She wears a sheer chemise dress. This famous portrait shows how classical style was not directly copied. This couch is inspired by the dining couches wealthy Romans used to eat at banquets. The original style is at the top right and is not curved or tall as the neoclassical version. The original Roman version is more functional, while the neoclassical is much more decorative. An excellent resource for designers for this period is Ackerman's Repository of Arts and Fashion. It was an illustrated British magazine published from 1809 to 1829, and it was very influential in the decorative arts. Neoclassical style corresponds to the time a young United States built many government institutions. The philosophy of the Age of Reason was directly responsible for the revolution and then the architecture we chose. The most conspicuous building is the Capitol, begun in 1793, burned by the British in the War of 1812, and then rebuilt. This marker celebrates the role of enslaved labor used to build it. And in a fit of irony that you can't just make up, this is the story of this statue at the right, titled Freedom. An enslaved artist named Philip Reed was instrumental in creating this homage to freedom. The biggest cultural influencer in Europe was Napoleon, who was both a threat and an incredibly charismatic figure. He was a man of action and an incredibly successful military man. He brought a merit system of appointments and promotions to the French government, as he himself had risen through the ranks to power. He was a large influence on the way men dressed all over Europe. The French invaded Egypt, and it was one of Napoleon's soldiers who shot the nose off the Sphinx for target practice. Napoleon decorated as if he were a Roman general on campaign, with a heavy influence on drapery that reminded him of military tents and furniture that looked like it could fold or be dismantled for travel. This is his wife's room, painted in Napoleon's favorite color of green. At the end of his career, he was banished to the Isle of St. Helena. His room was this same color. He died most likely of stomach cancer, but he lingered painfully for several years. This color contained arsenic linked to increased risk of stomach cancer. Analysis of his hair found significant exposure to arsenic. A servant tore some of the wallpaper away for a souvenir, and it was kept in his family. It was recently tested and proved to contain a large amount of arsenic, so some think Napoleon's taste in decor may have killed him. Napoleon's decor is more aggrandizing and powerful than British or American neoclassical decor, using more references to Rome and Egypt. As theater artists, we are often called upon to recreate eras from the past, so I'd like to show you some of the painters that can be helpful. You learned about David in the neoclassical art video. He is useful for studying a simplified version of classical dress and interiors. The artist Ung is an excellent source of detailed clothing and drawing styles. Both Angelica Kaufmann and Labille Guillard are portraitists showing people of the time. Suqueira was a famous Portuguese painter whose work demonstrates how Southern Europe developed its own styles. The first documented Black American portraitist, Joshua Johnson, painted the upper middle class and well-off Irish immigrants. Eichholz in Pennsylvania shows that American styles were more sober and simpler than European styles, as does the work of American John Vanderlyn. And John Lewis Krimmel, known as the American Hogarth, documents how the middle class lived. This concludes our study of the neoclassical era. Our neoclassical era contribution to dogs is the invention of tiny lapdog breeds. Such small dogs were considered fabulously exotic, and fashionable ladies everywhere wanted one. A breed called the Mexican lapdog was the smallest. It was so small, one was preserved in the British Museum.